Just a quick one. I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining me today and being with me on this show. One thing that is really, really important I want to share with you is this show is growing really well, and I'm so proud of it, and I'm so pleased that you're enjoying this content. But if you could please hit the follow and subscribe to this channel, it will really help the channel on its being able to grow and the people that we can have on this show. So please do consider, if you have a moment, please can you hit the subscribe button and the follow button, and I would really appreciate it. Coming up on Business Growth Talks, we're joined by Jodi Hume, the founder of At the Core and a trusted advisor to entrepreneurs and business owners. With over 18 years of experience, Jodi specializes in on-call decision support for helping founders navigate growth, leadership challenges, and acquisitions. A third-generation entrepreneur and a former COO of a fast-scaling firm, she knows firsthand the pressures of making high-stakes decisions. In this episode, we deep dive into Jodi's personal journey, how she helps leaders break through decision fatigue, and the strategies she's seen work for scaling businesses. Tune in for an insightful conversation packed with actionable advice for founders and business owners. Hey Jodi, how are you today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, thank you. Thank you very much for joining me on my show today. I think this is going to be an interesting conversation because I think there's going to be people out there that are listening and watching that aren't necessarily don't necessarily think they need your services, but when they're going to hear you and see you, I think they're going to see that there is real scope that you can help a lot of our leaders that are business owners or who listen to the show. So thank you very much for joining me today. The first question I ask all of my guests is, what does a business mindset mean to you?
I mentioned I'm a third generation entrepreneur, which means that a great deal of my childhood table conversations, it's not like we were always talking about business, but I think entrepreneurship is a mindset. And I think some of it's hardwired and some of it is learned. But business and entrepreneurship to me is about agility of thought. And so you like see a problem and you don't just look at it with a period at the end of the sentence and you're like, oh, there's a problem. And you just talk about it. Like entrepreneurs and I'm conflating business and entrepreneurship, although they can be different. But like that entrepreneurial business mindset is a dissatisfaction with what is when that's appropriate. Although that does have a dark side for entrepreneurs, but we might get to that in a minute. But a dissatisfaction with what is and an agility of thought of like, how can I make that better? You can't not desire to make things better. People really struggle with trying to be an entrepreneur because it's very romanticized. And so people are like, oh, I want to have a business. I see them struggle the most if they don't just have this inherent need to like make a thing better or understand a thing or look under every little rock. And just there is this underlying discontent put to good use. I think that I would make that underlying discontent that you then turn into something really useful in the world.
And it is a mindset, isn't it? Like I think you're right, because I came from my family gave me a more corporate background, and I went into the corporate world, and that was where I thought I was going to exist forever. And then through a self-development personal journey experience I had, reading books, listening to podcasts, going to conferences, seeing these entrepreneurs and that mindset, that really came into me. And then when I was ready to make the leap, I was able to leave a very comfortable corporate job and go into this crazy world of entrepreneurship. But I think it is really true. Some of it is inbuilt and some of it is learned as well.
Yeah, you have to have a certain amount of, I'd say, comfort with uncertainty. There's never a comfort with uncertainty. It's just an ability to override your discomfort with uncertainty.
Yeah, but it's comfort in taking risks. I think that's...
It is. But what is really interesting to me is I think there's a false sense of security in corporate.
Yeah.
Like it does feel like security. It does. But you are not at the helm. And so things can happen to you and you have no control over them. You cannot steer, you cannot push the gas or the brake. It's just, it is what is. And I do think of entrepreneurship and business almost like the distinction between being a teenager and an adult. And I don't mean that as like to compare that like entrepreneurs are more mature. It's not that. It's that Like teenagers, I remember my son when he was like, I can't wait to be an adult because then I get to make my own decisions and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, that's not always as fun as it
Yeah,
seems.
there's consequences to that as
Yeah,
well,
like,
isn't there?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Good news is you get to make all your own decisions. Bad news is you have to make all your own
Always the-
decisions. And so it's a little bit like that. It's like becoming, in that way, the parallel sits as like you are in charge of your destiny. And the bad news is also you are in charge of your destiny.
Yeah.
So,
So as you said earlier that you're a third generation entrepreneur, did you find that there was any pressure on you to be a business owner?
no, in fact, it also was not in my, like, I did not set out to do this work. And in fact, I only made the connection that I'm a third generation entrepreneur. And that is part of why I am so good at what I do. While doing a podcast interview about a year and a half ago, he asked me some question and I was like, oh, you know what? Like part of this, because he said, how long have you been doing this? And I started to give my regular answer, which was starting with my post college story. And for some reason it just hit me and I was like, wait a minute, I've actually been doing this work since I was like 5. It's just, it is the like the discerning what's most important here. I can remember conversations very early with my mom as she talked these things through with me. So yeah, no pressure to do that. I was going to become, anyway, I had a whole funny career version that I was going to do, but never was an entrepreneur. Never was an entrepreneurship.
So you were a COO at an architect's firm. Why did you take that long? And you were there for a number of years
Yeah.
and went up the ladder. Why were you there so long? Was it a great atmosphere? Was it the people? What was the driving force of you staying there?
No one has ever asked me that question. I am so excited. I will tell the story with glee. So part of it is that there is not a single thing that I get paid to do now that I even knew existed until I was like 30, maybe even like 32. So I couldn't have plotted my course to this destination when I was 20 if I had wanted to. So every single great thing that has ever happened to me has happened by just following the breadcrumbs of what gives me energy, what brought me joy, what seemed fun, what was interesting, paired with this architectural firm that I also just happened to hit at an interesting pulse of time. So I was going to work there 6 months and then go back to grad school and become a psychologist or counselor. I wasn't super set on that, but that's what I wanted to do, something in psychology and what makes people tick. I got there and it started off as I just loved the place. I loved the people, I loved architecture. Not because I have a big love for buildings, but because architecture is both really right brain and really left brain. And my brain needs both. If I was just a counselor, I think I would be really bored. And if I was just doing pure business consulting, I think I would be really bored. I love playing at the intersection of the two, where the diagnostic is this a business issue or is this a internal brain or interpersonal or like psychology issue, and teasing that apart. What's the really root cause here? And it just so happened that as I joined them, not only did I love it there and was it fun, but they were about 8 people when I started. And I like to make things better. And I was the receptionist for a couple months and they gave me the marketing job. I made that better. It was almost having my own tiny little company inside the company. I got to make it better. And then I did the same thing for finance. And then I did the same thing for just the office in general and ultimately became the COO. So I stayed because my brain was getting all of its itches scratched. I got to make things better. I got to have both the creative and there were spreadsheets and there was creativity and I got to just make things better. And I was also part of something. I helped grow that company and we did it together. I was part of the core leadership team from very early on. And as the marketing person, I got to sit in on the weekly leadership team meetings. And they did do things extremely well. Even after having worked with hundreds of companies since then, they are great at leadership. They were great at culture. They were great at how they worked with people. And a lot of what I have gone on to work with people on comes from that experience. So I got to be in those weekly leadership team meetings for 16 years. And so I saw all the decisions, all the mistakes as we grew from 8 people to we were just shy of 50 when I left. So it was an amazing experience.
Great. And then why did you start at the core?
Because the gum was losing its flavor for me there because there weren't as many things to make better. Once we got to 35 or 40 people, the incremental make it better were so much smaller. And a lot of it was maintenance and just like keeping the plate spinning. And I am extraordinary at making things better. I am not your girl to keep the plate spinning. Not only do I not like it, but I'm not good at it. Like, I'm down. If had I been hired for that job, they would have fired me probably 6 months into it. And it's a big reason that when I'm working with owners and leaders is to not overlook, and in fact, not just that, but to focus on what gives you energy and what drains your energy. And for better, that is what we just, it doesn't mean you don't have to do anything that drains your energy, but it is the thing that will drive the company's success and scalability, is as much as possible, not relying on you to do things that you are not good at and that in your energy. Both things are important, and they're not always exactly the same, but
no, and I think that's absolutely right, because that whole idea of draining your energy, if you're doing the same, this is where how burnout happens. This is how sort of fatigue happens in the business. It can happen in a business as much as it can happen in a corporate career as well. What do you do at the core? Like, why don't you break down the services that you provide to your clients to give us that clarity?
Yeah, for years I did more of a traditional coaching model, and it's not that. But what I really fundamentally, what I'll tell you, what frustrated me first, because that's what created, and a lot of entrepreneurship is looking at like, what's wrong with this industry, what's not working here, and then what does it need to be better. And I would get really frustrated that I was doing the basic thing, like we meet every other Tuesday or whatever, 2-3 times a month, and they would come to the call and they would tell me about something that had happened the week before, but like that ship had sailed. It was gone. They were like, what should we focus on today? And they would stumble around. And it was so not satisfying for me. And no matter how much I said to them, call me in between, don't wait for the session, call me when something happens, they just wouldn't do it. So I started playing around with the mechanisms of the model until I ultimately got to taking away all of the pre-scheduled sessions, and I made it all on call. So that was the only thing they were buying, was call me when you have an issue. I've slightly tweaked it since then. Most people have some kind of maintenance check-in, but it's different. It's smaller, and it's truly just to make sure there's nothing going on. And that's when it started to work, because this will sound like a leap, but it is related. The only parenting advice I ever give is don't listen to anyone else's parenting advice. Like, you can read all the books, you can ask your friends, you can ask your parents, you can watch all the TikTok videos you want, but at the end of the day, you know your child better than anyone else, and you will know fundamentally, intuitively what they need. And it might be different than everybody else's advice. And I will die on that hill forever. I believe the same thing with businesses. Like, most entrepreneurs somewhere know what they need. And occasionally they don't. Like, occasionally it is actually a knowledge gap, and like they do need a consultant or they do need a coach. But if coaching is ever set up in a way where you're trying to fix something in someone, where like they're at point A and you're trying to get them to point B because you're changing them, like, that has a place, but it has a very distinct place. And it's like, after you have rolled out these other things, then maybe there's a leadership thing to work on to get better at, or then maybe you need a consultant because there's a knowledge gap and it's just not your area of expertise. But I want to rule out all the other things that come before that tap into what you actually really know. Because sometimes when people are indecisive, and that's what I'm really trying to get at, I want entrepreneurs to not be spinning their wheels, to not be wasting time and energy either indecision or second guessing, to quickly validate that, hey, I think I know what I want to do, but I'm right on this side of pulling the trigger, and I just need to double check with someone for blind spots. Is there anything I'm missing here? Sometimes you need to think a thing through and you don't have a person to do that with for 1,000 different reasons, confidentiality, or they're just not the right person, or you don't want to bother them with the weight of it. There's a million reasons that comes out. But then there's this other little layer, like contextualizing where people are, because so much of business conversation is exclusively around what's going well. And even when you hear people's stories of what did not go well, it is almost always in the context of the hero journey of, and then I triumphed and this thing became perfect. And the reality is, business is really hard, and it's messy, and it's uncertain. And So many times I would talk to people and they would think that they were broken or not cut out for it because this thing was happening in their company, when in reality it's like a business puberty moment where nope, you're just at there's a weird thing that happens between like right around 10 employees and right around like around 20, like 18 to 24. There are these things that kind of happen where something gets awkward. It's literally just like puberty. Like all of a sudden your arms are extra long and you're like tripping over things or you smell a little funny. No, there's nothing wrong with your company or you. This is just what happens right here. And there's some things you can do to move through it with a little more grace, but it's just a transition phase. But if they don't have someone to hear that from, they think that it's them. And so I'm always listening for all those things, that and the energy regulation, because sometimes they're just tired and they need to recharge, which is the other one I listen for.
So talking to you there, you sound like you're part business coach, part therapist, part growth officer, how to take that next step. So you actually wear different hats. Do you wear different hats for different clients because they need slightly different things?
I wear different hats for different clients on different calls. Like right. It is the diagnostic. And that's why I called it at the core. Like what's at the core of this issue? Absolutely. By the way, I cannot say that I'm a therapist because I'm not a licensed therapist.
No, but it's like emotional support that you're giving people. My wife's a trained therapist, so she'll pick me up on that as well. But
exactly.
Saying it's like the emotional support that you give them.
No, it's 100%. And it's the emotional because here's a really fascinating thing. I'm a super neuroscience nerd. Like I read neuroscience books for fun. Everyone thinks about executive functioning, which is clearly, obviously important for entrepreneurs. It's all of the strategic decision making and prioritization and visioning. Like all that stuff happens in your prefrontal cortex. There are two things that are basically work as prerequisites to that. It's not quite right, but it's close enough for this conversation. If they're messed up, the executive functioning doesn't work as well. And both emotional and energetic regulation. So if you are emotionally wound up, all that executive functioning is not working at its best. If you are exhausted, and I don't just mean sleep deprived, although also that, but run down, like those two things, your emotional and energetic regulation, get in the way of you being your smartest person. So I have had people come to the call they're trying to grapple through a business decision. And after I ask a couple of questions, the entire thing that they're trying to figure out is only happening because they're trying to avoid one hard conversation or because they're just really afraid of something that maybe is like more of an anxiety than a risk assessment. Is just a nuance of the difference in those things. I have had, and the other interesting thing is there's a interplay between operational issues and interpersonal issues. And so I've had it come the other way. I've had calls come where two C-suite level people are absolutely at each other's throats and they think they might have to lose one of them. And sometimes it is just an interpersonal issue, but sometimes it's because business growth has created a weird misalignment in operational pieces that is then causing those two people to have like bone on bone kind of interpersonal issues. And so sometimes it's actually an operational problem. So the diagnostic of what is actually the issue here is the part that I love the most. And then depending on where that goes, sometimes we're sorting through some like emotional pieces and sometimes there's a spreadsheet. It could go either way.
So what do you think's been more important for you as a business owner? The 15 years worth of experience as a COO and that growth that you went through the business, or your psychology training that you've done?
Is there a choice C where I don't have to choose? I don't know how I would. Yeah, I don't want that to be that's the easy answer, or maybe not easy, but it makes me not have to choose. So it's an easier answer. But I think part of the problem though is if you try to separate them. I think trying to do business without thinking about the humans that have to come along for the ride is where a lot of businesses come from. But it's also true that if you're only thinking about the people, the business can lose out. I actually, when I work with folks, a lot of times I put the business as another person at the table. If my company is at the table with the couple of people on my team, it also needs to get what it needs. And I'll ask the question, what does at the core need? Not just what does Jodi need or what does Giselle need? Like at the core has needs. And so you have to think of it that way, integrate all of them. But people, there are very few business decisions that you can make that you don't have to drag humans along with you. And hopefully you're not dragging them. Like hopefully you can do it in a way. So that's why I don't separate them. Some of the most amusing moments in my life is when I'm meeting in my business is when I'm meeting a new potential client and they're talking about something. I don't do a lot of giant corporate work for many reasons, but once I did do a giant corporate contract. And when I first met with the head of that division, this back when I still did a lot of work in like culture and whatnot, he said, this is a quote, we've designed the new culture and we want to go around all of our locations and present the new culture. And we know that buy-in is really important. So at the end of each workshop, we're going to have them sign a commitment to the new culture.
Sounds awful.
And I was like, what do you think? And I literally said, I was like, do you want my honest answer or do you want my answer? And because I just met this guy. Yeah. He was like, yeah. And I was like, that is going to crash and burn in such a just like fantastic inferno of fire. Like nothing about that is going to work. He's like, why? And it's just a complete detachment from understanding what, like in that context, you're talking about change. So my favorite change theory, because it's so simple and it's so actionable, you don't have to take classes in change theory, is a guy whose name I'm not going to remember, but it is all about thinking almost like an ice cube. Like people are ice cubes. And if you want to rearrange what's in the ice cube, first you have to thaw the ice cube. You have to thaw what's there before you can have conversations about how you move it. And so that means addressing their concerns, their current perspectives, it's a lot of different things, but you have to get them into a state where you can move things. You can't just come in and be like, here's what you're doing. And it's hard because you spend a ton of time doing strategic planning or thinking through it. And then you walk in and to people who have had no line of sight to anything you've thought through. They didn't watch you throw out options 1 through 4. They also didn't get to see that all 5 options were pretty not great and that actually there were no good options and you had to pick between a bunch of really not great options. So they send this thing and you want them to be like, awesome, we'll go do that.
So in my experience, I worked at one company that culture was very important. It was embedded in the whole mantra of the company and it was concerned about, and it was a progressive company. Another company, not so progressive, they had their values written on the wall. Yeah. And that for me is a bit of a red flag, because if you don't know what the culture of your business is and you're having to rely on plastering it on the walls to try and convince the people, and when you're talking to people in that company about the values, they haven't got a clue.
And where it does,
it's been communicated. They've done a presentation on it to the team to tell them what these values are. But unless it's embedded in everyday action, you're not going to get it working well.
And I want to actually just elaborate on what you mean by embedded, because embedded is the part that people sleep on. It doesn't saying it or repeating it. It means it has to show up in, if you have I'm trying to think of a value that I won't dislike, but because the ones that don't mean anything, like what does excellence mean? I mean, that doesn't actually mean anything or whatever, but you have a value. If you don't model for people that you are using it, like here are our 4 key guidelines. Like you have to, if you're not using them to hire, fire, make decisions, openly using them as litmus tests for whether this thing will move us closer to or further away from what we have supposedly said are our values. How does this decision look through the value of X or through the value of Y? If they don't see you use them, then you are modeling for them that they have no purpose or use in your business. And if they're on the wall and that's the only place they are, that's the thing. Because being on the wall isn't like in and of it. But if that's the only place they show up, then they have not been embedded and integrated in. And I had a client who had done a really good job. Like I learned so much from him over the years of like how to lead large organizations well. He did so many things right. And he did a really good job of I'll go even further than embedding and like grinding them into the fabric, like a stain you will never get out. Like they were everywhere. And I ended up working with several layers down of his folks. And it would make me smile every time we'd be talking about something and they would use those words. Also know is it gets embedded in the language.
Yeah.
Like those words would show up in the language of how they were doing things. And that's when you've done it really well.
Yeah.
But that takes so much time and so much commitment over a long period of time. It is both a deep and a wide commitment to make that happen. You can't just, it's not like tossing flower seeds out into the yard and hoping you have this beautiful garden. That's just not, it's more like a bonsai tree.
And it's got to come from the leaders. It's absolutely, they've got to be modeling those cultures, those values. Because
in fact, that's why I actually kamikazed the giant corporate culture program that I was hired to do. I joke about kamikazing it, but it really was. I was like, we can't do this. Like, we shouldn't continue with the second half of this contract because the leadership they weren't on board. Like they were tolerating it. They were allowing it. But the champions for this were a couple layers down. And I really, I stared at it before I had this meeting and said that, but I could tell that it would actually cause damage to be giving people all of this guidance around what you wanted to be and it had happened already once or twice. And then the head person comes in and at a quarterly meeting says the complete opposite. And then people they're like, what? We don't know what to do. The guidance here. And that is causes harm in the long. It's not clear. And any misalignment at the top shows up in the organization. It's like, it ripples way bigger. Yeah. And it gets bigger as it goes.
Yeah. One of the things that when I was doing the research, you help people with difficult conversations, difficult situations to deal with. Can you give me an example of a client of yours that you've helped, that you've been able to manage, coach, get them through those difficult conversations that they've had?
Yeah. So I'll give you kind of two examples, but one thing I do, I half jokingly call business couples therapy, which is when I mentioned this before, when they're really important people, they don't have to be partners necessarily, but when there are people that are really important to the organization that just cannot, the relationship has gotten more toxic. And when that happens, I sometimes get called in the first step is not to fix it. The first step is to discern if it's fixable. And so I meet with one of them and then I meet with the other one. And at the end of that conversation, I ask them a question that I'm very clear. I literally say, I'm going to ask you a question and it sounds like there's going to be an immediate answer that you're going to feel like you're supposed to say, but I'm not interested in that answer. I need to know your answer with absolute candid honesty because otherwise you're wasting our time. And that is, can you see a way? Can you believe that it's possible that there's something else going on here than the way you're seeing that other person? I'm not asking you to believe that they're a great person and that everything's rosy, but can you entertain the possibility that the perspective you have is not the full story, that maybe there's more, that there's something else here? And if you can't, that's okay, but let's not waste everyone's time and energy. If you can, that's all I'm asking. I'm not asking you to see them differently or imagine that they're like the best person in the world, but that's just the starting place. And most of the time people say yes. One time I had a guy say, can I think about that? Because I want to say yes, but I'm not sure I can. And he came back and he's like, I can't. I wish I could, but I'm locked down on this. And that's great too. It's sad. It's a bummer, but there's no point going forward from there. But the reason that I need them to just be able to entertain that, be open to that possibility, is in all the times that I have done that work, always there has been just like a misunderstanding at some point and then there was probably some like inadequate communication between the two of them about that thing. Because let's face it, most of us were not brought up in households where conflict resolution and emotional regulation and all those things were extraordinarily well demonstrated. Yeah. So we all bring our baggage around, I think he thinks this. And so I'm going to take my toys and play over here thing. And then stories get made up and stories get made up and stories get made up until you have utterly demonized this other person And the things that are showing up in the company are like when if you and your spouse are arguing about the trash and it has nothing to do with the trash, it's basically like that. And so if I can get them to just see each other's perspective, that's the starting point. It doesn't make all the other things go away because a lot of times they are super different people. But for them to come back to some of the hygiene of let's start fresh here and then see where we can work from it, build some shared understanding and empathy, and then rebuild that that trust. But the other thing too, and I touched on this, is people are just really good at misunderstanding each other and filling in the blanks with things that are not true. And sometimes they're true, but they're not talking to the other person. So there's no validation about whether it's true or not. And therefore, you're creating a narrative, they're creating a narrative, and there's no checking in on that. And so I'll just tell you a very quick story. I had a guy call me and he was like, and we were on Zoom and he literally had those legal pads. I don't know if they have those in the UK, but they're skinny. Yeah. Which he had written like single line, 2 pages of everything he wanted to say for this woman who worked for him, because he had decided that he was relatively new in the position. He had decided that she didn't think he was qualified, that she didn't think he was the right person, that she didn't like him because she had snapped at him in a client meeting, which was not okay. Like that he addressed. But he was so upset about it. He had written this whole thing. And I said, okay, you might be right. Like, we don't know. I'm not saying you're wrong, but we have no idea. I said, do this for me. You can take that in there, but let's face it. How often have you made up how a conversation is going to go and then it actually goes that way? It never goes that way. So take it with you. You can use it if you need it, but just simply ask her. And this is the little thing that I teach people sometimes. State something that you notice and then either ask a curious question or just leave curiosity open in the space. So in this case was like, hey, I noticed that we've been butting heads a lot lately. What do you think? Or do you notice the same? Don't film it. And I think that means just state a thing and be like, what do you see? I said, and just start there and see what happens. You can always go back to your notes if you need them, but just try that. And he comes back, he calls me like 15 minutes later. He had just gotten through, seems like we've been butting heads lately. And she burst into tears. And she was like, I know. And I snapped at you in that meeting and I wanted to talk to you, but I didn't know how because I was so embarrassed and I feel bad. And turns out she had recently gotten married about a month before that. And since they moved in together after the wedding, they were fighting constantly. And she was about her life. And she was like, and I'm yelling at everyone. And I snapped at my mom and I voted and I'm just a mess. Had he gone in there and thrown the napalm that he wanted to throw at her, she would not have shared that. She would have just quietly looked for another job and that would have been the end of it. And so I think we overestimate how much we have to figure out about hard conversations. And so, yes, I do help facilitate really sticky, complicated conversations in like bigger teams, but most of the time it's actually them back to just what's your experience? Just say that, the simplest thing, and give the other person an opportunity to share their side. And a lot of times it's just not that. So there's not that much conflict even.
It sounds like empathy is a massive part of what you do, because people obviously create stories in their head. They create a narrative, as you say, like someone snapped at them in a meeting. You run ahead a million miles to a conclusion. And actually, in your example, she was going through some personal stuff and she couldn't quite regulate herself in the work environment as well.
Which wasn't great. You don't snap in a client meeting. That's like, it's not okay. That's true. And there's another truth. So,
but how do you teach empathy? Because I think like emotional intelligence and helping people gain empathy is really tough, because if people aren't set on that sort of mindset and see value in that, how do you work with your clients to try and bridge that gap that they can start being empathetic with other people in their business?
Yeah, so that's a tricky question. There's a certain amount of that is filtered by who I choose to work with.
Okay.
If I'm not in the business of trying to convince people that empathy is worth their time and energy. Like if they don't, lots of us skip over empathy in a self-protective way. We're trying to make sense of a thing and we intellectualize a moment and forget to look through the lens of empathy. So that I will answer your question about that part of it. But when I am talking to someone, if they are dead set, like I've had people come to an initial call and they just want to talk about, they fundamentally believe that everyone in their company is just trying to get away with stuff and will only work if they have to, and they have to be managed, and that everyone's lazy and they don't like, I don't know. That is maybe if that is work for someone else to do in the world. I've been able to like influence that perspective occasionally, but someone really has to want to be on the other side of the seesaw. They have to want to learn about leadership and be open to other perspectives, or it doesn't work. Also, I just don't understand. If someone's not interested in empathy, I'm not sure we could communicate because they won't hear. I will talk and I will sound like Charlie Brown's parents to them. I'll be like, wah, 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 wah. So for me, it's like the work where empathy comes up is more about remembering to look through empathy. But even I actually don't talk about empathy that much. It's more curiosity, honestly. It's like empathy doesn't even get to have a seat at the table if you can't come to a conversation with curiosity. And so what I do teach is seek first to understand. Like before you jump in with solutions, and actually that's across the board. I run a roundtable for CEOs, and part of the time that we are together, someone talks about a problem that they're having or an opportunity they have or whatever that they want some other brains on. And once they present the basics, the next step is you ask questions. We do not jump in with, here's what I do, or I had that time, this is what we're us, because it's not the same. It also assumes that they are putting up the right issue and they're talking about the symptom that their company is experiencing. But something I learned in my architecture days is water leaks in a building where water is dripping in your house is very rarely, or not very rarely, but is often not relevant to where the water coming in. It comes in and it runs like clear across the house on a beam, and then it drips in by your fireplace sometimes. Yeah. And so the seeking to understand, and that's what I did. That guy that I was telling you the story about, I didn't try and get him to embrace empathy. I just said, be curious for a minute, ask what's going on, find out what's at a very simple layer, very simple version. I had someone who was thinking about firing their admin because they were always late. And they had never talked to the admin about it. They just assumed that everyone should know you should never be late, blah, blah, blah. I said, just say, I'm noticing that you're never here on time. What's the scoop? What's the blah, blah, blah. Turns out there was like this very tricky bus issue that she was having because of the times of the bus. And if she took the earlier bus, she wouldn't be able to take her kids. It was a very complicated logistical issue. And she was only getting there 4 minutes late. So she didn't think that mattered. So they problem solved that together. And she's still there. It's 8 years later. And she's like the best office manager they've ever had. So it's like a little dab of curiosity. You don't even have to have empathy, not against empathy, but just be curious.
The difficulty in that situation was the admin didn't think 4 minutes was a big issue. But right. For the boss, he was like, this is a big issue. And it is people's perspectives obviously evolve and change. So one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, how has your work evolved over 21 years at the core?
Yeah. So one of them was moving from a couple of things. One, when I first started doing the coaching work, I think I imagined that I was going to be like, not cheerleading, but that I would be like, I didn't think of it this way, but pushing people toward their goals. Oh, you want to do this amazing thing. Let's like run towards it. And what's been really interesting is that, especially as I honed in on the people I really wanted to be working with, which was mostly owners, like very driven people who are already like running at a certain speed, it is actually, and it's not just those people that this is true of, a majority of the work is actually slowing people down, either in actual speed or in the number of things they're trying to do. They're trying to do way too much. So it was an unexpected shift of, instead of pushing, it's almost more like reining them back a little bit to, not in terms of how big they think, not that, but then what they imagine they can accomplish in a certain amount of time. As a friend of mine says, strategy is what you don't do so that you can be good at a couple little things. So that was one shift that I just didn't see coming. But following This is something I did for myself that I think is the most important thing you can do for your business, any business that's trying to grow and scale, which is follow the breadcrumbs of what feels right. And I'm making like a very intuitive thing, but it's not just that. But not being afraid to eliminate things that aren't working, or hone in on things that are. Like, I just kept following these breadcrumbs of something about coaching didn't feel right to me. And here's the real clue about it. A lot of times when something's not the right fit for you or your company, it will feel like a weakness. And there are absolutely sometimes when getting better at a weakness is necessary, but most of the time it's a really good sign that's what you should not be doing. And so, for instance, like in the coaching model, when I learned, like at the end of the session, you like give the client homework, because it's as much about what they do between sessions as what they do with time. So in the time with you, that's, to me, I agree. You're setting them up to use that time between sessions, but I'm really bad at making up. It's not that I'm bad at making up homework. I absolutely sometimes give my client, like, before we talk again, I want you to focus on this, or think about this, or try this, or have this conversation, or whatever. But so much of the time it felt arbitrary, like I was making up something for them to do. And I'm really viscerally against performative anything, like anything that you're doing that isn't solidly grounded in purpose and meaning. Like, I just about. But I kept trying to get better at it. And then slowly I trusted that feeling. And I was like, this isn't the work I'm supposed to be doing. I'm not here on this planet to give people who are already crazy busy and like running these companies, to give them homework. It's not, I don't believe that's what they need. And so then, with curiosity, saying, what is it that I think they need? And what I think they need is just almost like the phone a friend on that game show from years ago, and to like there when they need it, someone who is completely confidential, who has no horse in their race, so completely objective. I'm not invested in their business. Their decisions don't affect me, who can meet me both emotionally and business savvy wise, depending on what's going on, so that I can feel better and do my best. And they're there when I need them and not when I don't. That's what I think they need. And so I built a company around that. And has that been easy? No, because that doesn't like exist with a handy name. But when people hear about it, they're either like, oh my God, I didn't know that existed. I've always wanted that. And it just works. Or they're like, why would someone need that? And you're like, cool, no worries.
And that's an end of a conversation, isn't it? But yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's quite a unique approach to something that is fulfilled, as you say, with a coach, with a mentor, with a therapist, with a consultant. But sometimes you need someone with your unique perspective to be able to, as you say, like rein people back, not as in progressing forward and moving their company business, but just giving them an emotional check as well on making assumptions, because assumptions are a massive problem when you're dealing with people and things like that if you don't have the conversation. So I think you're hitting a unique and interesting space.
And I want to make one other. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
So I want to be super clear about something. Like, I am not. This doesn't work because I am some sort of super special guru. I definitely have talents. My brain works a very specific way, but I also have people that I rely on in this way. And it's not their specialty. It's not what they do for a business. It's that when it's like watching someone else parallel park a car, like you're in it and there's so much uncertainty and you can't not see all of the things that then become blind spots because you can't separate the variables, which is a lot of the work that I do. Like back when I was the COO, I used to do like the first level of troubleshooting for IT. And to troubleshoot IT, you have to separate the variables. Oh, this can't connect to the network. Let me swap out the cable. Okay, it's not the cable. But then you've isolated whether it's the cable. And when it's in your own brain, like I can't isolate my own thoughts because they're so conflated together. And so this is a thing that everybody needs in some way. And you just, as a business owner, I think you have to have people that you can talk to. I think that the worst thing in the world is whoever made up like it's lonely at the top. Like it can be lonely. There's a lot of reasons why it feels lonely at the top. You cannot allow it to stay lonely at the top, or your business will suffer. Too many bad things happen in that isolation space. Sorry.
Look, we're coming to the end of the interview. I ask the same 6 questions to all of my guests. They're quick fire questions. They don't need a quick fire answer. The first question is, what's the best decision that you've made?
Across life in general, or
whatever you want.
Okay. Best decision that I have made probably would be, oh my gosh, this is a really hard question. Best decision that I have ever made. It's funny, I was just scanning my entire life flashes before your eyes, like where are the best. Funny, 2 things popped to mind that I will have to a little bit process through why these 2 things popped to mind, but they popped more than once. So I'm just going to trust that they were there. Right. One of them was to try out for So I did theater, a musical theater as a kid. And I got to be in Nonsense, which is a small musical that only has a cast of 6 characters.
Okay.
Or maybe 8. And I did it in summer theater one summer when I was going to do something else in college that summer, but I went home and I did summer theater that year. Maybe it was right before college, whatever. And I played Sister Robert Ann, which is the badass nun. She's the way, she smacks gum and she wears red Converse sneakers or whatever. Yeah. And that was the antithesis of who I was. I wasn't a total goody 2-shoes, but I was also, I don't know. Yeah, probably I was and there was something about taking on that role and trying on a different personality, literally trying on a sweater, put it on and then you take it off and you put it on and you take it off. And by the time that was over, I was a little bit about this that I think I need a little bit of this. And so I do think it was a big, it uncovered a part of something that has become much more interesting in my life. And so that popped to mind. And then maybe similarly, the other thing that popped to mind was going abroad my junior year. Again, not because of some specific thing that happened and then that led to this success funnel or something, but more just great. And actually, yeah, now that I put it in that context, every time I did something that expanded my awareness of who I might be and what might matter to me and what I care about and what gives me joy and what lights me up, every time I've done that, it has been a really good decision.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for your honesty. Second question. What's the best piece of advice you've been given?
I think the best piece of advice I have ever been given came back to trusting fit, to trusting my own gut, even when it doesn't make sense, or even when I can't put my finger on it, even when there's not a lot, to just trust fit. If it's not a good fit, then it's not right. The other way I've heard that said, if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no kind of a thing. Yeah. If you are questioning fit, you probably have your answer. And that's a really hard one. That's a hard one. That's a hard one.
Yeah. And I get what you mean when you say, because decision making as a business owner and entrepreneur, you often have to say no a lot more than you initially think. Because
especially after you've had a little bit of success. I we have to wrap, so I won't go into the whole neuroscience of this, but they did all these studies around why the book Essentialism was written after an article. So he first wrote a Harvard Business Review article where he talks about this, that they studied why do people have a little bit of success and then don't keep having that much success. And it's because of success, you get more options and then you tend to diffuse your efforts. So you have to keep your efforts and focus tight to continue to have that success. And it's so hard. It's so hard to say no to good ideas so that you couple them really well. It's so hard.
Who's the person that's helped you most in your career?
It's a combination of 2 clients that I've had that, because of my confidentiality things, I can't name them, but they are both, I'm sorry, I to be a bummer about that, but I really can't. But they are 2 clients that I have had that I have learned from as much as I have helped. They taught me about I learned so much from them about being extraordinary leaders. And because I got to watch it happen, and I could see it wasn't just theoretical. I watched how it was working inside their brain. I watched how they demonstrated it outward, and then I saw the impact in their organization. So it's like good old watching the chimps or something. But I learned some really amazing things, specifically around how to be a really strong and firm leader while also never abandoning your empathy and your interest in the human. And it seems like a weird place to focus on this, but specifically the thing that I watched that I gained so much respect around was how the first one, it's a man and a woman, but how he went into firing conversations. Like, I think a lot of people in termination conversations, in order for it to be doable, they leave their heart and humanity in the other rooms. They can go in and be just like, here's what's happening. And it's definitely easier. It's less painful to do it. But he brought all of his empathy and compassion into that room. And it was gutting for him. Like, it was really hard, but he was able to have the conversation in a way that they felt met and understood and cared for. He actually went in with this presence of, I care too much about you to let you stay in a position that's not the right fit for you. And I want more for you. I want more for you than that. Find you something that works. Yeah, and amazing. So it takes away the shame of it a little, but he had to mean it, and he did. So
tell me about a regret that you have.
It's really funny. The regret I have is actually, so a little bit too. I should have left the architecture firm before I did. I really should have. I don't necessarily regret it because it was fine. It worked out fine, but not paying attention to my own sense of fit and paying a little bit too much attention for loss aversion. I felt so connected to what we had built together that I couldn't imagine not being there. I felt really emotionally invested in it. And that overrode my taking in of other things. The other thing that I do regret, like I also can't control, but I wish TikTok had existed earlier, which sounds very funny, but I have learned a lot about like early childhood parenting, especially around emotional attunement. It'd be surprising for some people if someone knew me who saw this, they're like, you're so emotionally intelligent. I am about certain things, but there are things that I have learned about how you can actually help people be able to name their own emotions, not just figure them out. I'm great at like, where does that come from? The emotional intelligence part is like, where does that come from? What's that tied to? What do you do about it? But you're feeling this way. I do regret that I didn't learn some of those things earlier when my kids were still tiny.
Next question. What are you most proud of?
So actually, this might have popped to mind just because we were talking about my kids. Parenting is such a terrifying experiment because you're like pulling levers and twisting knobs and you don't get to find out for 20 years how it all pans out. You're like, it's kind of like entrepreneurship. You're like, except at least you get like KPI and ROI along the way. I centered one and only one thing in all my parenting decisions. And a great number of times that was terrifying because it went against standard guidance on certain things. But the only thing I centered was trying to help them and push them towards being the most them possible. So my son's name's Turner. My daughter's name's Kaya. I'm like, I want Turner to be the most Turner he can possibly be. I don't have a strong attachment to what that looks like. I want Kaya to be as Kaya as she possibly can be. And I don't care what that looks like. So I wasn't big on grades and all these extracurriculars to get you into the right college. And there were sometimes that was terrifying that I was like, oh, maybe I should have pushed more so that they could this or whatever. I don't regret it once. They are now 18 and 22. And I am so proud of how when I watch them be so clear about who they are and make decisions accordingly. And I feel like if you nail that if you are clear on who you are and then have the courage to navigate accordingly, you can't lose. And it's just so easy to get swayed by other things. And it's hard not to, but I'm really proud of that when I
see. My kids are 8 and 10, so we're in very formative years of making sure they're both girls as well. So making sure that they're confident and sure-footed in the path they want to tread.
Into some tough years where like people love to diss on 13-year-old girls because they can be a little rocky. Guess what? Like, they actually know themselves and they're not exactly savvy and doing it in the most like tactful way sometimes, but I did not want to break that part of you got to know yourself and then you can learn how to do that in the world in a way that doesn't break all the dishes. But you don't want to snap that initial clarity on what you care about. So
amazing. Thank you. Tell me something that most people don't know about you.
I think because of the things that are easy for me, I think a lot of the things that are easy, just simply easy for me, are things that are hard for other people. Like public speaking doesn't bother me. Performing on a stage doesn't bother me. Like I don't get performance fright in that way. So I think that makes people think that I am just this like endlessly brave and don't get whatever kind of person. The things that I am that way about are things that other people will be like, what? I'm sorry. Like, why? Like walking into a room of like moms in an elementary school kind of thing. Like I become this like shell of a human where I'm like super insecure and I don't know what to say. And I feel like I think sometimes people are surprised by what does absolutely be like, oh no, I couldn't possibly do that. And they're like, what? Because for them, they're like very easy things. So I think for me, that world of bravery is like a little bit flipped, in part because I have this weird glitch where I say yes to things without really thinking it through. And then I have to use my scrappy resourcefulness to figure out how to do it. It looks like bravery, but it's actually not. It's more like a glitch where I just already said I would do a thing. And now it's more terrifying to admit that I don't know how to do it than I just figured it out. Over years became confidence, because that confidence is you're like, oh, actually I can figure things out. Yeah. But that's different than like other things where you're like making it up in the moment, where I can be really daunted quickly. Yeah.
Thank you for your vulnerability. I appreciate it. What does legacy mean to you?
Wow, that's I don't think, I'm still open to this idea. Like sometimes you realize later that you care about something you don't think you care about. I don't think about legacy a lot. And maybe my view on that is slightly skewed because I've had a great number of clients for whom legacy is like a central guiding thing and for definitely the legacy of what I leave behind in the world and these like businesses and like legacy with a capital L. So it might be that I do think about legacy with a small L and in italics. It's not a motivator for me, is maybe the better way to say it.
Okay.
I think the part of legacy that I do think about is how it shows up in my kids, which has never been about what I sculpt them into. It's almost more about what I don't leave them with. I don't want my kids feeling like I never wanted my kids feeling like they were responsible for my emotions, or I don't want my kids feeling like they owe us coming home for Christmas. I want my kids want to come home for Christmas, but if they can't, I get it. So that is probably the legacy that I think about the most. On the business side of it though, and Matt, actually I will add this one thing. On the business side, the legacy that I would love to see happen is to remove some of the taboo nature of being able to talk about business issues without it feeling like it breaks everything. Like that it's easiest to understand if I think about a CEO I work with talking to their investor, the most heightened version of this. If they go to the investor and say, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this job, because that's how they're feeling.
Yeah.
The chance that investor will be like, I don't know about this guy is high. Yeah. Whereas if that investor could just meet them and what's making you feel that way today? And it is a momentary thing and not an admission of failure. Yeah. So much would be different in the world. And I think most entrepreneurs feel like that in most places, they can only say, here's how everything's great. And here's how everything's wonderful. And there's so much cheated out of your company being able to grow when you don't have a place to process through what's real. What's like real, honest business is what I would like to see a legacy of mine be, like business being a more real and honest conversation.
Yeah, amazing. And lastly, where can people find you if they want to reach out to you or learn more about your business?
So two things. So atthecore.com is the website. If you go to atthecore.com/gift, that is where I put there's a couple downloads. There's at least one download there. There might be a second one at the moment. I can't remember. I change it often. There's some 50% off sessions because I know people are like, what is this thing? But even that, there's also a link for a connection call because what I do is a little off the beaten path. And so if someone's curious, but they're not ready to jump right in, just book a call with me. It's a half an hour. We chat. I do not turn those into a sales call. That is not what that session is for. It's more just to try out what it's like to have someone to think off of and just for a test for that. And then from there, you can find me on all the socials. So that is also where to find that.
Thank you, Jodi. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been fascinating hearing about you and your thought leadership and the way that you conduct your business. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. I really hope you've enjoyed that content. It's a really fascinating interview that I've done there. So please do, if you are enjoying this content, please do give it a like. Please do give a subscribe. It'd be really good to boost the subscriptions. It really makes a difference to the algorithm in YouTube. So thank you for that. If you do hit subscribe, hit the bell icon and you'll get all of the content. You'll get notified when all the content is available. Thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated. Thanks a lot.